How's everybody doing? So today we're gonna do a little demo on texture. So applying texture to some of your pieces. Now you guys should all have components started. You should have a number of different things that are, you know, kind of a raw clay right now. So hopefully you're starting to think a little bit about texture as you've been looking at artists and you know, as you've been building your own compositions. It's time to start thinking about how these things are going to go together and how texture can you know, relate to form, and that relationship between texture and between form to help heighten or, you know, contrast or do anything like that to draw attention to. So I hope you're starting to think about that sort of stuff. And today I'm going to show you some quick, simple ways to go about doing that. Now texture, really, you can do whatever you want here. Like I've had students take slabs of clay out and slap them against trees or car tires or you know, brick walls. And you know, clay is unbelievably responsive, as you guys have probably already started to realize. It picks up the tiniest little bits of detail, like your fingerprints, for example. So it's gonna collect a lot of information if you're going around and kind of you know, trying to pull it from different things. Like I said, brick or something like that. If you're like, you know, if you want to try to get a specific texture, find that thing and see if maybe it works as something to use for texture. Like I said, a tree is a wonderful thing to grab texture with. I'm only going to show you using some of your basics pottery tools, ways in which to start to collect texture and then wrap texture around forms or something like that too as well. So I'm going to start off here. I have a clay slab prepped. I have one really kind of loose, kind of flabby thing of clay. I have one that's starting to stiffen up, and we're going to kind of play with some texture on both of those. So like maybe some of your pieces that you've let set up a little bit longer, now they're ready. You know, you're starting to build forms with them. They're going to react differently. They're going to take texture differently than something that would be like a really wet surface, for example. So you're going to notice different bits of texture. So one texture you put on a really wet slab is going to be different than something you put on a little bit slightly more rigid or slightly more set up leather hard slab. So just know that, and as you move on to you know, the harder the material, the harder the clay, the slightly different texture you're going to get. Now the wetter it is, the more, you know, the more difficult it is to really get that refined detail. So if you want something that has like a lot of detail or something like that, you might want to wait till it sets up a little bit more. Like this is a cylinder I made not too long ago. It's starting to get about leather hard. It's still, if I could squish this if I needed to, or if I wanted to, but you know, it's rigid enough that I can kind of hold it without it altering shape too much. So this might be a good time to get some nice, more refined detail. As it sets up even further, I could go in and carve in a little bit more too as well to kind of pull that detail out. So the first thing I'm going to do is maybe start to play around with some different textures on some of the different slabs. So maybe have a couple slabs, find a couple tools that you're interested in that might leave an interesting texture. Like I said, they're all going to do a little bit different. You could start even with just like a knife like this. I'm going to use the end of this tool here. This is going to lead, and I'm going to make some kind of circle textures, almost like a fish scale or something. So I'm just going to start pressing into the clay and just seeing what happens. Seeing how it kind of squishes and moves around the tool. What kind of texture it's leaving. And notice too, like sometimes you need to do a couple, you know, cover an entire surface. Or if you just take a dot and put it on there, maybe that might not really tell you exactly what you're looking for. But now here's an interesting kind of scaled texture, you know, something like that. Maybe I want to use the other end, which is just this kind of fat pin here, and then we want to start to kind of do some combing, really quick, kind of more gestural, almost like grass or something like that. I can cross hatch with this if I needed to get some kind of interesting texture here. So I want you all to start to make a couple little slabs and just start playing with them. This is like I said, a really wet slab. It's giving us some interesting texture. Now if I started to do those same things on a more set up piece, it's going to be very similar, but I can almost control it a little bit more. I can control with this one how the texture lays on the piece. I can control it a lot more. I can actually touch the clay too, where I'm going to be putting down texture without worrying about it squishing around too much. So this is a really nice little chunk here. So this really actually sets up and gives me kind of a more refined texture. So that's that same one. Same with this, the other one that I did. You know, I can really start to kind of just hone in a little bit better. Like I said, it's a little bit more rigid now. It just responds in a different way. And you'll notice that. You'll know if you're trying to carve detail in something that is super wet, it just won't happen. It just won't, I mean, it won't happen as easily. Something like that, see? Okay, so I'm gonna stick with kind of those two textures. I'm gonna show you, so that's a way, I want you all just to play around a little bit first, before you commit on some of the forms that you've been making. Just play around with some scrap pieces of clay and just see what kind of textures there are. I mean, there's all kinds, you can use any kind of tool, you can press in, like even if we wanted something like this thing, you know, I want you to just play around, you know, like, have some fun with some of the textures and just see what happens. See what you can get. See what happens when you start folding it around, the play around and stuff too as well. So for this one, I'm actually going to use just my putty knife, and I'm going to use just the edge of it. I'm actually going to just comb this space, and then I'm going to wrap this around a form. So first things first, I'm just going to take this edge. I'm just going to press lightly. Actually, you know what? I'm going to use a ruler too. So I've got this ruler here. I'm just going to use the edge. I'm just going to carve straight down on this ruler. Just right down. I'm going to press lightly. I'm going to try to get some nice straight, clean lines. I'm just going to go the length of the ruler. I'm just going to go that space. So right down, keeping it nice and straight. Straight down. Not pushing too hard. Like I said, there's so many different textures out there. You guys can go explore. Have fun. For my thesis show, I went around the whole school, and I'm gonna do a little cross test now. I'm gonna just go right perpendicular to that line, one right on the edge. And it's just about gathering this buffet of different textures. So I was taking slabs of clay and just putting them on everything I could find, and really kind of recording and paying attention to the textures of the university. Of the art building mostly, and that, I had like 100-some samples of just different textures. So there's so many things out there. Grab some grass, rub it on here. Grab a rock, rub it on the clay. Just see what happens. You don't have to use it. So now I've got this cool kind of like waffle-like texture. Super simple, right? So now I'm going to take it and just kind of flip it over. I'm actually going to roll this out in a cylinder. I've got it all kind of ready to go. I'm just going to lay it down softly. I'm not going to push too hard, else I'll lose that texture. I'm going to see I've already got my cylinder here kind of pre-rolled, and I'm just going to kind of wrap it and measure it out. I'm just going to kind of wrap it around this form. I'm showing you how to gain form or gain texture that influences the form slightly. It's gonna build a really interesting relationship with it. I'm going to mark it out here real quick. Roll it down. We're just going to cut it. All of you know these steps already, so I'm not going to kind of really go over this too much. Slip and score, remember? Slip and scoring. Put a little slip down there. Both sides. Well, I'm going to score real quick. Y'all should be getting pretty good at this part. Really make sure it's good and secure. Part gets stuck a little bit. Lost a little part here. I might cut through accidentally. Sweet. So now I've got this this form here, right? I've got this texture that's wrapping around the form. It's actually kind of spreading as it wraps a little bit. The lines are changing as the form stretches out a little bit, which is something that, clay does, right? As it stretches, all that material needs to go somewhere, so that mark that you made starts to open, so it starts to talk about that stretching of the material around the cylinder, so all of a sudden now these lines really start to emphasize the curve of the cylinder, right? And we could even push that even further. I'm going to take this out. This would be, you know, if I came in here and just started to kind of push from the inside, maybe I want it to crack a little bit. I want to break through, or I want to alter the cylinder slightly. This is something y'all can do too as well. Now I'm starting to get a little bit of altered cylinder. There we go. So something like this. You see how now we're starting to talk a little bit about the volumes on the inside, but the lines are starting to move a little bit with the form, right? Set that aside. So now I have this form here that I made for the last demo. I'm just going to give it some texture. I just want to give it something light, soft, and subtle. You know, maybe I just want something that just helps lift off a little bit. Really, just throws a little bit of contrast from a nice smooth surface to something that's like, you know, done very delicately, but still kind of is emphasizing that relationship between the form and the texture. So I'm just using this ribbed tool here. Which we have some of these. If anybody's wants to use some, I can let you borrow it if you'd like. But basically, you do something like this. You could use you know, this just the end of this or some of your line just to do something. But I'm just going to kind of carve up. Once again, this is just a way in which to start to talk about this relationship between the form and the surface. And also, as we start to think about glaze, as we start to think about slip, which we're going to get into here in a couple days, this is another way to kind of start to build a surface that might react slightly differently with a slip or a glaze, right? So I'm just kind of combing, getting this really nice, kind of almost like tree barky texture. But it's kind of starting to talk about the length of this piece. See, now we get this really soft, kind of subtle texture, where if it was in contrast with something like this, potentially, you know, now we start to get a really interesting relationship here. So if I had this laid in one of my compositions, perhaps like this, I just get this really interesting textural component, right? Something like that. Great. Same thing with something like this. Now I was playing with the texture a little slightly earlier, so here's a half sphere. I'm just kind of starting to poke holes, right? Not holes, I'm sorry. Just starting to kind of press into the form with the end of this skewer. If I were to cover this whole thing, it's really going to give an interesting texture. So for your guys' assignment for 1.3, I want you to start to play around with texture. I want to see some experiments. I want to see some little test pieces, something like, you know, like these here, where you're starting to explore a specific texture. And push it further, you know, be like, okay, this is when I'm just doing, you know, doing this nice and lightly. This is when I'm pushing really hard. I want to see kind of what happens. I want to see your experimentation. I want to see your process of thinking. So now you can see I could start to cover this whole thing, and this is going to give this thing a really nice organic look. Maybe coming back over it even and kind of softening that out a little bit, pushing that back into the material, coming back over with my finger, seeing how that even softens everything and almost gets rid of it a little bit, but still, it's almost like when metal is starting to be worked and kind of tinged out, it really, you can still see some of the marks, but it's starting to cover up a little bit, right? So that's a way in which we can get some interesting texture. All right. So basically we could do something like that. The other thing I wanted you all to think about too, potentially, is as you're starting to, another way to think about texture, I'm just going to use this same tool. You could use your X-Acto knife to cut through, anything like that. But maybe even perforating, actually like poking holes, cutting windows, cutting squares, triangles, whatever. But even how those positive and negative spaces are also creating texture, a visual texture, right? This one here is creating a really interesting very kind of very physical texture here. You know, something I can touch and see, but also it's a very visual texture too, right? Something along those lines, and as the light kind of comes through, it really creates an interesting texture, right? And even on the inside, something kind of crazy like that. Maybe your piece is like this, and this is all, its whole interior piece just has these kind of crazy textures here. So how you can kind of create some drama, or create some soft, subtle contrast between some of the pieces through some texture, right? Texture is going to be a wonderful component to your guys's compositions. The other thing too is you could potentially start to play with the slip too as well. So this is our chunky clay, right? The stuff that we're using to slip and score everything together. This potentially could be a component. You kind of whip it up really nicely. This one isn't, I would need to let this set up a little bit longer. It's kind of dried out on me, but this could be a potential, you know, if we started to kind of place on some of this slip too as well, and then kind of smear that back in and see how that texture kind of, you know, we could get some interesting kind of frosting looking stuff too as well. You know, the stuff is going to be like frosting, right? When you're going to slip and score. This is just the same clay, so we could put it back on and let it kind of do its thing. And now we're going to get some really interesting kind of surface here too. So we start to kind of play with that, right? Something along those lines if you're looking for a muddier kind of surface. So there's so many different options. So don't limit yourself with just one or two different kinds of texture. Like I said, I encourage you, take a slab of clay, cut them up, walk around, find textures that are interesting, and you know, put some clay on it and see what happens. Just be sure to clean it up after you do that. But you know, try a brick wall. See what sort of textures you can pull from different places. Okay. So 1.3, exercise 1.3. I don't have a set number of different things, but I'd like to see quite a bit. I'd almost like to see a board full of different textures. Right, something like this. I'd like to see everybody with at least you know, at least 10 different examples of some different textures that you're playing with. It can be anything. Look, here's this X-Acto blade that I'm just turned on the side. I'm not cutting it through anymore. I'm just kind of giving it some of this. It almost looks like feathers. Like, so you're going to start to, the more you play around, you'll start to see different things. So it's just like, do them quick. Don't try not to think about them too much. But before you're really going in and putting stuff on your forms, look at that. That's just the side. That's a super interesting texture, and you got to kind of look past it and see how it potentially is going to look once you wrap it onto a form or something. So we bend it a little bit, and it starts to kind of stretch out. So I want to see. I'd like to see a number of different tests, a number of different examples of different textures, even just with my fingers. You know what happens when I just kind of like, you know, build up my own. I can take some rock, some clay, and just kind of like smush a little bit on here. Like here's a piece here, and just kind of taking a little bit of wet clay and just kind of like smearing it on to this piece. It's leaving some really interesting combination, interesting textures here too, right? So I want to see you kind of exploring a little bit, playing around. Okay, so I'd like to see a board with at least 10 different kinds of textures. All right, and then start putting that onto your work too as well. So I think this is due. This will be due for the Monday-Wednesday class. This is I'm going to be due on Wednesday. For the Tuesday-Thursdays, it's going to be due on Thursday. Okay, and by Thursday, you all should be about, say, 75% done with your project at that point. Okay, we're gonna have a reading assignment coming up. We're gonna have a couple different things. So make sure you're keeping up with your work. If you're feeling a bit overwhelmed, or you're feeling you're falling behind, just come talk to me, and we'll see how we're doing. We'll assess the situation. All right, everybody. Thank you. Bye.